December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The Japanese fleet had struck with precision, sinking battleships and crippling American naval power in the Pacific. But even in the celebration of that victory, the Japanese Imperial Navy knew a grim truth. Their empire ran on oil, and oil was scarce. Japan possessed virtually no domestic petroleum reserves sufficient to fuel a modern mechanized warfare. Its industrial growth and naval expansion had been fueled almost entirely by imports from the United States, the Dutch East Indies, and the British-controlled regions of Southeast Asia. Every ship, every plane, every truck relied on imported fuel. Before the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese naval strategists had conducted meticulous calculations. Battleships like the Yamato burned thousands of barrels of fuel per day. Aircraft carriers consumed enormous quantities of aviation gasoline, while submarines and destroyers required constant diesel resupply to remain operational. Japanese stockpiles were sufficient for only a few months of sustained combat operations. Every operation beyond Japan's home islands was a gamble against the clock, and the clock was running out. By late 1941, Japan had already begun to strain its oil reserves. The government, aware of potential American embargoes, had secretly stockpiled fuel, but the volume was minuscule compared to what the Navy demanded. The Imperial Navy's leadership understood that any prolonged conflict with the United States or Britain would inevitably expose this vulnerability. Plans were drawn, scenarios rehearsed, yet the sheer scale of Japan's dependence on foreign oil was staggering. A single carrier task force operating at full speed could consume in a week what Japan produced domestically in an entire year. The attack on Pearl Harbor, in many ways, was driven by necessity as much as ambition. Japan needed to secure the oil-rich regions of Southeast Asia, Borneo, Sumatra, Java, and ensure a supply line that could sustain its war machine. Every drop of oil mattered. Without it, the empire's great ships would sit idle and its aircraft would be grounded. Yet the planners also knew that even with initial successes, these newly conquered regions would be vulnerable to Allied counterattacks. The Japanese military faced the cruel arithmetic of fuel. Victory required not just strategic brilliance, but uninterrupted access to petroleum. Back in Tokyo, Imperial Navy officers pored over maps and shipping reports. Convoys from the Dutch East Indies had to traverse thousands of miles of hostile waters. Every tanker lost to submarines or aircraft would be a direct blow to Japan's operational capacity. Officers wrote memoranda, calculating that the moment fuel imports were cut off, the entire Pacific Fleet would face paralysis. The calculations were simple, terrifying in their clarity. Japan did not produce enough oil to fight a modern war. Every major offensive required importing more than could be stockpiled. In the months before Pearl Harbor, Japan attempted to mitigate this vulnerability. Synthetic fuel programs were initiated, though these were decades behind German hydrogenation efforts and produced only token amounts. Internal reserves were expanded, but every barrel hoarded could only postpone an inevitable crisis. Japanese officers joked privately that the Navy's operational plans were as much about conserving fuel as they were about conquering territory. Yet outside the walls of the Imperial headquarters, no one spoke openly of the looming disaster. National pride and military culture demanded a facade of confidence, even as fuel shortages quietly dictated strategy. By the dawn of December 8th, Japanese carriers were already at sea, executing the opening moves of the Pacific War. Sailors and pilots had no way of knowing that the Empire's fate was tied not to the bombs they dropped, but to the invisible lifeblood of petroleum. In essence, the war had already been fought before a single shot was fired, in the quiet calculations of fuel consumption and supply vulnerability. For every barrel Japan consumed, the United States produced hundreds of thousands. The numerical imbalance was staggering, though unseen by most contemporaries. As the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, Japanese planners felt a strange mixture of exhilaration and dread. Their strike had achieved tactical surprise and destroyed significant American firepower, but the longer-term war hinged entirely on logistics. Without secure oil, without control of the Dutch East Indies and Malaya, the mighty Japanese fleet, with its legendary battleships and carriers, would face immobility. Even as victory parades loomed in newspapers and official communiques, the specter of fuel shortage lingered. unseen but unyielding, dictating the empire's choices, constraining ambitions, and planting the seeds of a crisis that would grow to define the Pacific War. Even before the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, Japanese strategists were acutely aware of the empire's fragile lifeline, the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. Borneo, Sumatra, and Java contained the vast majority of Southeast Asia's petroleum reserves, critical not only for fueling the Imperial Navy, but also for maintaining Japan's mechanized army. The Japanese military had long calculated that without controlling these regions, its capacity for extended operations would collapse. Yet capturing them required a monumental gamble. Landing forces hundreds of miles from the home islands, across sea patrolled by Allied submarines and aircraft. By December 1941, Japan had stockpiled a small emergency reserve at several naval depots, but these caches were negligible in comparison to what the fleet consumed daily. A single fleet carrier group operating in sustained combat could drain these reserves in a matter of weeks. Japanese planners knew that the conquest of the Indies was not just a military operation, but an industrial necessity. Without oil, battleships like the Yamato and Musashi would sit immobile, aircraft carriers would be grounded, and the Army's tanks and trucks would be stranded. Fuel dictated strategy. The plan for the Indies, known as Operation C, was meticulous. Naval convoys would protect transport ships carrying troops and supplies, while fast-moving carrier groups provided cover. Japanese engineers had already assessed the oil installations, noting storage capacity, refining potential, and the number of tanks required for immediate extraction. Speed was critical. The Allies had air reconnaissance throughout the region. Every day delayed increased the risk of Allied interdiction. Each barrel captured had to be processed and transported north quickly to feed the growing war machine. In Tokyo, intelligence reports painted a dire picture. American embargoes had cut Japan's access to critical crude from California and the Philippines. Domestic production in Japan was insufficient by orders of magnitude. Without imports, fuel reserves would last only months, perhaps weeks in the event of sustained naval operations. High-ranking officers quietly acknowledged that the coming war was as much about barrels of oil as about bombs and bullets. Admirals debated risk versus necessity, ultimately agreeing that speed and surprise were the only ways to secure the lifeline before illicit forces could intervene. Meanwhile, in the Dutch East Indies, Allied engineers and oil workers scrambled to protect the installations. Tanks, pipelines, and storage tanks were fortified, sabotage plans were drafted, and emergency evacuation protocols were prepared. Japanese planners knew the risk. Even if the islands were captured, the Allies could destroy facilities, denying the fuel to the invaders. Every day, Japanese staff calculated how much oil could realistically be extracted and shipped to the home islands. The numbers were sobering. Even under perfect conditions, the logistics of transport, protection, and refining would push Japan's limits. December 10, 1941. Japanese convoys departed from bases in Formosa and Palau, carrying troops and supplies. Aircraft carriers steamed ahead to secure the airspace, while destroyers and cruisers screened against potential submarine attacks. The men on board had no inkling that the war's decisive battle was not only about the islands they would occupy, but about every gallon of fuel they could secure. For the Imperial Navy, fuel was both sword and shield, the lifeblood of their striking power and the measure of their survival. Japanese planners had built fuel consumption into every operational scenario. Carriers were ordered to operate at economic cruising speeds whenever possible, conserving aviation gasoline. Battleships fired only when necessary, and submarines were instructed to avoid prolonged high-speed chases that would drain diesel. The calculus was relentless. Victory depended not only on defeating enemy forces, but on ensuring sufficient fuel to consolidate gains. One miscalculation, one destroyed tanker, and the entire campaign could stall. In January 1942, Japanese forces began capturing refineries and storage facilities across Java and Sumatra. Engineers moved quickly to repair bomb damage left by retreating Allied forces. Every jerry can, storage tank, and pipeline section mattered. Naval officers supervised the loading of crude into tankers bound for Japan. The process was painstaking. Delays could mean losing the captured fuel to Allied air raids or sabotage. By February, Japanese intelligence reports indicated that the volume of fuel extracted, though significant, was still insufficient to sustain simultaneous campaigns across the Pacific. Fuel had to be rationed, allocated strictly to priority operations. Strategic decisions, whether to continue pushing into New Guinea, the Philippines, or towards Australia, were directly tied to how much oil could be delivered back to Japan each month. Even minor miscalculations threatened operational paralysis. By mid-1942, the pattern was clear. The Japanese war machine could advance, but only in increments dictated by fuel availability. Ships would operate in fuel-conscious task groups, aircraft sorties were rationed, and army mechanization slowed where diesel was scarce. The empire's military brilliance was constrained by an invisible hand. Barrels of oil. As Japanese fleets moved deeper into the Pacific, the stark truth remained. Without sustained access to foreign oil, even the greatest naval victories could not secure lasting success. By mid-1942, the Japanese Empire appeared unstoppable on maps. Vast territories across Southeast Asia and the Pacific were marked in imperial colors. Yet beneath this image of expansion, the Imperial Japanese Navy was already beginning to slow. Not because of enemy action, but because fuel consumption was outrunning supply. The oil captured in the Dutch East Indies was flowing north, but never in the quantities planners had envisioned. Every mile steamed, every sortie flown, quietly eroded the margin Japan desperately needed. The first signs were subtle. Training schedules were shortened. Naval exercises were reduced in scale. Carrier pilots, once encouraged to fly relentlessly, now logged fewer hours in the air. Aviation gasoline was reserved for combat readiness rather than proficiency. Younger pilots entered battle with fewer practice flights, while experienced crews were told to conserve fuel wherever possible. These decisions were not announced publicly. They were internal adjustments, invisible to the outside world but deeply felt within the fleet. Battleships and heavy cruisers faced similar restrictions. Rather than operating at high speeds, task forces were ordered to cruise at economical settings. High-speed maneuvers, once a point of pride, became rare exceptions. Destroyers tasked with escort duty found their patrol ranges shortened. Submarines were instructed to avoid unnecessary chases and remain on station only as long as fuel allowed. The Navy was learning to fight while rationing its own movement. At the operational level, fuel calculations began to shape battle plans. Commanders now considered not only enemy strength and geography, but also how much fuel a mission would consume, and whether that fuel could be replaced. Ambitious operations were scaled back or canceled entirely. Some task forces remained in port longer than intended, waiting for tankers that never arrived on schedule. Each delay carried a cost: lost initiative, missed opportunities, and growing vulnerability to Allied counterattacks. The Battle of Midway would later be remembered as a decisive turning point. But for Japanese logisticians, the lesson was broader. The loss of 4 fleet carriers was catastrophic. Yet the more troubling realization was how difficult it had become to replace what was lost. New ships required fuel to operate. New aircraft required gasoline for training and combat. Even victories now carried hidden costs that could not be absorbed indefinitely. Inside naval headquarters, staff officers revised their models repeatedly. Charts showing projected fuel availability grew more pessimistic with each update. Tanker losses, maintenance delays, and refining limitations reduced monthly deliveries. Even minor disruptions rippled across the entire fleet. A single sunk tanker could affect multiple operations thousands of miles away. The Navy's striking power was becoming brittle, impressive on paper but fragile in reality. Morale within the fleet began to change. Sailors noticed that ships spent more time anchored than underway. Pilots sensed the difference in their training tempo. Commanders, once confident in their freedom of maneuver, now spoke cautiously about range and endurance. Fuel had become a constant presence in every conversation, every briefing, every decision. It was no longer an abstract resource. It was the limiting factor of the war. By late 1942, Japanese fleets still fought fiercely, but the tempo had shifted. The empire could no longer afford continuous pressure across the Pacific. Operations became episodic, carefully timed, and increasingly defensive. Every mission was weighed against the same question: how much fuel would it cost, and what would have to be sacrificed elsewhere? While Japanese planners focused on decisive surface battles, Another war was unfolding far from the headlines. It was not dramatic, not fast, and not glorious. It took place beneath the surface of the Pacific, where American submarines began methodically dismantling Japan's lifeline, not its navy, but its fuel supply. At the start of the war, Japanese leadership viewed submarines primarily as fleet support weapons. They were meant to scout, ambush enemy warships, and support decisive engagements. Commerce raiding and attacking merchant shipping was considered secondary, even dishonorable. This doctrinal choice would prove catastrophic. The Americans, by contrast, came to see Japanese logistics as the true center of gravity. By late 1942, American submarine commanders received clearer orders. Sink tankers first. Oil tankers were rare, slow, lightly defended, and irreplaceable. Japan entered the war with fewer than 100 modern oil tankers capable of long-range transport. Each one lost was not merely a ship destroyed, it was a percentage of the empire's total fuel capacity erased forever. The early months were inefficient. Faulty torpedoes plagued U.S. submarines. Magnetic detonators failed. Perfect attack runs ended with dull metallic clicks instead of explosions. But even with these limitations, pressure mounted. Japanese escorts were inadequate. Anti-submarine warfare was underdeveloped. Convoys were small, irregular, and poorly coordinated. The sea lanes stretched thousands of miles, from Borneo and Sumatra to the home islands, too vast to defend properly. By 1943, the balance shifted decisively. Torpedo defects were fixed. Submarine tactics improved. Wolfpack-style patrol zones were established around critical choke points. The South China Sea, the Luzon Strait, the approaches to Japan itself. American submarines waited patiently, tracking shipping lanes rather than chasing warships. Tankers became priority targets. The results were devastating. In 1943 alone, Japan lost over 40% of its tanker fleet. In 1944, losses accelerated further. Fuel that existed in Southeast Asia simply could not reach Japan in sufficient quantities. Oil sat uselessly in storage tanks in Borneo, while ships in Japan lay idle for lack of fuel. Geography had become a trap. Inside the Imperial Japanese Navy, the implications were terrifying. Fleet headquarters began receiving reports that sounded unreal. Refineries had crude oil but no transport. Naval bases had ships but no fuel. Training commands requested gasoline and were denied. Battleships became floating steel fortresses, unable to sortie. Aircraft carriers, once symbols of imperial power, were tied to their piers. Even worse, there was no solution. Japan lacked the industrial capacity to rapidly build new tankers. Shipyards were already overstretched, replacing combat losses. Every new tanker launched required steel, labor, engines, and fuel to operate. Meanwhile, American submarines were sinking tankers faster than Japan could even plan replacements. The war beneath the waves had a cruel asymmetry. An American submarine could burn thousands of gallons of fuel on patrol and still be resupplied effortlessly. Japan, however, lost entire operations when a single tanker failed to arrive. Each sinking echoed far beyond the explosion itself, reducing sortie rates, limiting pilot training, and grounding fleets across the Pacific. By mid-1944, Japanese naval planners began to grasp the truth. They were not being defeated by superior tactics alone, nor by individual battles. They were being strangled, quietly, systematically, without drama. The empire still had oil, but it no longer controlled the sea lanes required to move it. By late 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy faced a paradox that no amount of courage or discipline could solve. On paper, Japan still possessed battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft carriers. The hulls were intact, the guns were functional, the crews were present. What was missing was movement. Fuel allocations were now measured not in operational needs but in desperation. Headquarters issued monthly fuel quotas that barely covered basic readiness. Ships were instructed to remain at anchor unless a mission was deemed absolutely essential. Even then, commanders were told to calculate not how to win, but how to return, if return was possible at all. Training had effectively collapsed. Carrier pilots, once elite professionals, flew only a handful of hours per month. New pilots graduated with shockingly low experience levels. Some had never practiced carrier landings at sea. Aviation gasoline was locked away for emergencies that never came, while skills eroded quietly on the ground. Battleships suffered a similar fate. Vessels like Yamato and Musashi, the largest warships ever built, consumed fuel at staggering rates, over 70 tons per hour at cruising speed. Keeping them operational required tankers that no longer existed. These ships became immobile symbols of past ambition, floating monuments to a strategy that assumed limitless resources. Operational planning turned inward. Sortie ranges were reduced. Missions were designed around the nearest available fuel depot rather than strategic necessity. Some operations were approved knowing in advance that ships might not have enough fuel to withdraw. In extreme cases, commanders were told to plan for one-way missions, accepting destruction as an outcome rather than a risk. The psychological impact was severe. Sailors watched American fleets operate continuously, striking, withdrawing, and redeploying without hesitation. Japanese ships, by contrast, waited. Days passed, weeks. Morale declined not because of defeat, but because of helplessness. A navy designed for maneuver warfare had been reduced to static defense. Even logistics itself consumed fuel Japan could no longer spare. Escorting convoys required destroyers. Destroyers burned fuel. Protecting fuel shipments cost more fuel than the shipments delivered. The system fed on itself until nothing remained to sustain it. By early 1945, the Imperial Navy no longer planned campaigns. It rationed survival. Fuel was reserved for coastal defense, kamikaze operations, and last-ditch responses to Allied advances. The concept of strategic initiative had vanished. The fleet existed, but only as a shadow of its former self. The ultimate expression of this reality came in the form of desperation missions. When Yamato sailed on the Operation Tengo in April 1945, it did so with fuel for a one-way journey. There was no plan for return. The largest battleship in history went to sea already condemned by fuel arithmetic. It was sunk before reaching its destination. By 1944, the fate of the Imperial Japanese Navy could be expressed in numbers alone. No battlefield report, no after-action summary, no heroic narrative was required. The war had reached a stage where arithmetic decided everything. At the beginning of the conflict, Japan consumed approximately 30 million barrels of oil per year. Even in peacetime, this level strained the empire's resources. Japan possessed almost no domestic oil reserves. More than 90% of its petroleum came from abroad. War transformed this vulnerability into a fatal weakness. The oil fields of the Dutch East Indies appeared at first to solve the problem. In theory, they could supply much of Japan's demand. In reality, production was inconsistent, infrastructure was damaged, and refining capacity was limited. But even this was not the central issue. The true bottleneck was transport. Oil that could not be moved was oil that did not exist. By mid-1944, Japanese tankers were being sunk at a rate exceeding replacement by a factor of 5. Every month, fuel production figures remained relatively stable while delivery figures collapsed. Charts produced by naval logistics officers showed a widening gap between available oil and usable fuel. The difference represented ships that would never sail and aircraft that would never fly. Fuel consumption told an even harsher story. A single fleet carrier required thousands of tons of fuel per sortie. A battleship division operating at speed could burn more fuel in one day than a destroyer squadron used in a month. Aircraft training programs alone consumed quantities Japan could no longer afford. Every choice involved sacrifice. American numbers made the comparison brutal. In 1944, the United States produced over 1.8 billion barrels of oil. Japan managed less than 30 million. The U.S. Navy did not calculate whether fuel should be used. It calculated how fast it could be delivered. Japanese planners calculated whether fuel could be spared at all. Losses compounded the problem. Fuel shortages reduced escort operations. Reduced escorts increased tanker sinkings. Increased sinkings further reduced fuel availability. It was a closed loop with no exit. By late 1944, some refineries operated at partial capacity not because oil was unavailable, but because there were no ships left to distribute refined fuel. Internal reports became increasingly grim. One naval memorandum stated plainly, "Fuel limitations now define the operational boundaries of the fleet. Another warned that by early 1945, fleet-wide operations would be, well, mathematically unsustainable. These were not opinions. They were conclusions. Even defensive operations suffered. Coastal patrols were curtailed. Radar stations ran on reduced generator schedules. Emergency reserves were broken into piecemeal allotments. Fuel that once powered empire now powered survival. Part 6 ends with the realization that Japan was no longer losing battles. It was losing equations. There was no scenario in which fuel deliveries could catch up to fuel consumption. No tactical innovation could reverse production ratios measured in hundreds to one. The collapse was not sudden, but it was absolute. By 1944, the Pacific War was no longer a contest between fleets. It was a contest between systems. On one side stood Japan, measuring fuel in barrels and planning operations around scarcity. On the other stood the United States, measuring logistics in time. How many hours until the next convoy arrived? How fast fuel could be delivered forward? How quickly losses could be replaced? The American approach to war was built around abundance. Oil was not treated as a precious resource, but as an assumption. The United States produced more petroleum than the rest of the world combined. Texas, California, and Oklahoma alone supplied volumes Japan could not imagine. Refineries operated continuously, refining fuel faster than it could be consumed. This abundance shaped everything. American fleets trained constantly. Pilots flew daily. Ships maneuvered at high speed as a matter of routine. Fuel consumption was a planning detail, not a limiting factor. If a task force burned more fuel than expected, more would simply be delivered. Logistics was industrialized. Tankers sailed in massive convoys protected by overwhelming escort forces. Fuel depots were constructed across the Pacific: Pearl Harbor, Eniwetok, Ulithi, Leyte. Floating fuel farms followed the fleet. The American Navy could refuel battleships, carriers, and destroyers at sea, allowing operations to continue without returning to port. Standardization amplified this advantage. American ships used uniform fuel types. Engines were designed for efficiency and reliability. Spare parts were interchangeable. Maintenance crews trained on identical systems. A damaged ship could be repaired quickly, refueled, and returned to action. Japan had none of this depth. Every Japanese tanker sunk reduced future operations. Every canceled training flight degraded pilot quality. Every idle ship represented lost potential that could never be recovered. The asymmetry widened with time. The psychological impact was immense. Japanese commanders observed American fleets conducting sustained operations that would have exhausted their own fuel reserves in days. American carrier groups struck, withdrew, and struck again. Japanese forces responded only when fuel could be spared, and often too late. Even American waste carried meaning. Engines left running. Vehicles abandoned when repair was inconvenient. Fuel used for heating, training, and experimentation. To Japanese observers, this behavior was incomprehensible. To Americans, it was simply efficiency within abundance. By late 1944, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The United States was not merely defeating Japan in battle, it was overwhelming it with tempo. America fought at a pace Japan could not match, recover from, or even fully comprehend. By late 1944, the Japanese Imperial Navy was a fleet of ghosts and shadows, still magnificent on paper but crippled by the invisible chains of fuel scarcity. Their carriers, battleships, and cruisers remained technologically advanced, yet the vessels themselves were prisoners of logistics. Every sortie, every maneuver, every night spent at sea required precious barrels of oil that were no longer guaranteed. The Japanese Navy had been designed to deliver decisive blows, a doctrine rooted in the Kantai-Kessen strategy. One great battle, one knockout strike, would end the war. Pearl Harbor had been that vision realized in miniature, a stunning demonstration of audacity and precision. But the Pacific War quickly evolved into a grind, a contest not of skill, but of stamina. And stamina demanded fuel, not courage. By 1944, fuel shortages dictated the tempo of every operation. Task forces that might have executed lightning strikes in 1942 now hesitated, waiting for enough oil to gather. Training hours for pilots, once carefully scheduled, were slashed. Young aviators were sent into combat with minimal experience. Ships remained in port, idle, while the Americans refueled and struck again. Even Japan's few remaining supercarriers could not change this reality. The Shokaku and Taieho-class carriers, intended to dominate the seas, were as vulnerable as any supply line. The moment fuel ran low, these mighty ships became immobile monuments, unable to project power. Japanese admirals recorded in their logs, operational plans were no longer based on tactics. They were constrained by rationed barrels of gasoline and aviation fuel. Meanwhile, America's industrial system converted abundance into action. The U.S. Navy could launch multiple carrier task forces simultaneously, rotate them continuously, and still have resources left to refuel forward-deployed ships. The contrast was glaring. Where Japan counted barrels, the United States counted hours. Hours to resupply, hours to reach the next objective, hours until the next strike. This strategic imbalance had cascading effects. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, often called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, illustrated the consequences. Japanese carrier air wings, already undertrained due to fuel rationing, faced American pilots who had flown hundreds of hours and had a nearly endless fuel supply. The result was catastrophic. Japan lost hundreds of aircraft and experienced pilots, an attrition they could never replace. The lesson became obvious. A fleet designed for single, decisive engagements could not survive a war of attrition against an enemy who could fight continuously. No amount of tactical brilliance, kamikaze attacks, or bold maneuvers could bridge the gap created by logistical inferiority. In essence, Japan was fighting yesterday's war with today's resources. By the end of 1944, Japanese officers recognized the harsh truth. Even when ships survived battles intact, their crews often had no fuel to move, no ammunition to continue, and no prospects of reinforcement. The war had shifted from the decks of carriers and battleships to the oil fields and pipelines of the Pacific. Every empty barrel was a silent executioner, determining who could strike, who could flee, and who would eventually surrender. By late 1944, Japan's Navy was a shadow of its former glory, clinging to a few remaining carriers and battleships, each vessel a precious jewel limited by barrels of fuel. The war had become a contest not of strategy or courage, but of who could keep engines running, planes flying, and ships moving. For the Imperial Navy, the numbers were brutal. Their monthly fuel allocation could no longer sustain training, patrolling, or major operations. Every gallon was now a weapon in itself. Admirals and captains gathered in dimly lit rooms, maps spread across tables, plotting their last gambit. Operation Shogo, the decisive operation, was conceived as a desperate attempt to use what little fuel remained to inflict maximum damage. The goal was audacious: strike the American fleet supporting the Leyte landings, hoping to turn the tide of the Philippines campaign. Every ship's captain knew the stakes. The war had shifted from the open ocean to the fuel depot. Aircraft carriers could launch only a single strike before returning, and even then, only a fuel tanks permitted. Battleships designed to move in formation and deliver devastating salvos could barely steam to the staging points without ration barrels being carefully measured and distributed. Engineers recorded consumption down to the last liter, their calculations dictating who could sail, who would remain in port. By October 23, 1944, the Japanese center force, under Admiral Takeo Kurita, left Brunei Bay. The plan was precise: move quickly, strike decisively, and return. Yet the fleet's engines groaned under the weight of overconfidence and scarcity. Cruisers burned at double the usual rate navigating narrow straits. Destroyers carried only enough fuel to cover half the journey and return if nothing went wrong. Every deviation, any delay, any unexpected maneuver was potentially fatal. The gamble was apparent during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Kurita's fleet engaged the American 7th Fleet in the Sibuyan Sea. Japanese battleships and cruisers fired massive broadsides, shells weighing hundreds of kilograms, consuming tons of fuel for each salvo. Aircraft launched from carriers, their fuel tanks barely filled, had to complete strike runs and return, or they would be lost. The engines of both ship and plane were now extensions of the supply line. Without fuel, they were corpses. The Americans, by contrast, operated in abundance. Each carrier had reserves allowing multiple strikes per day. Each plane could return and refuel immediately. Each task force could maneuver with minimal restriction. The contrast could not have been starker. While Japanese pilots were rationed to one strike, American aviators could fly sorties repeatedly, often without returning to port for several days. By evening, the results were visible. Japanese ships damaged or sunk, pilots stranded at sea, fuel shortages preventing retreat or regrouping. Korea's flagship, the Yamato-class battleship Musashi, burned thousands of liters during gunnery maneuvers and rapid maneuvers to evade torpedo attacks. Despite her armor and firepower, she became a floating coffin when American dive bombers found her. Fuel scarcity limited evasive maneuvers, slowing her speed and making her an easier target. By the time she sank, over 3 million liters of fuel had already been consumed by the fleet's engines, resources that could not be replaced. Even when the Japanese sank American ships, the victories were Pyrrhic. Every ton of fuel spent could not be replaced. Every barrel used in battle was a barrel that could not move another carrier, a battleship, or a plane in the next engagement. It was a war where success cost more than failure could tolerate. By the end of the Leyte Gulf operations, the Japanese fleet had lost more than a dozen ships, hundreds of aircraft, and with them, the capacity to mount large-scale naval operations ever again. Fuel scarcity had become the ultimate arbiter of naval power.
By December 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy had been reduced to a fragile skeleton of its former might. The carriers that once projected power across the Pacific now sat idle, their decks largely empty, engines silent. Battleships, once the symbols of invincibility, were now massive, immobile hulks, constrained by barrels of fuel that no longer existed. The arithmetic of oil had rendered their legendary courage irrelevant. The catastrophic losses at Leyte Gulf were not merely a tactical defeat. They were the confirmation of an irreversible strategic collapse. Admiral Suemu Toyoda, chief of the combined fleet, had reviewed the reports with a grim understanding. Japan's navy could no longer conduct sustained operations. Fuel reserves that might have enabled one decisive sortie were insufficient for even a single follow-up attack. The war was no longer being fought with skillful maneuvers, bold strikes, or fanatical bravery. It was being fought with barrels, liters, and gallons, and on that front, Japan had already lost. The remaining carriers, Shokaku, Zuikaku, and Junyo, were immobilized by rationed fuel allocations. Aircraft squadrons trained for months were now grounded, their pilots idle, while fuel ships struggled to deliver what little remained. Even auxiliary vessels, destroyers, transports, and supply ships could only make one-way voyages, often to evacuate men or attempt token reinforcements. Every mission was a gamble against the unseen enemy, scarcity. Meanwhile, American forces operated in overwhelming abundance. Each carrier could launch dozens of sorties daily. Aircraft carriers refueled in hours, battleships repositioned with ease, and amphibious operations supplied continuously by fleets of oil tankers and the logistical marvel of floating pipelines. The Japanese, by contrast, were forced to choose which ships would move and which would remain dead in the water. Every decision was a subtraction from their already dwindling operational capacity. The Battle of the Sibuyan Sea, the engagement of the center force at Leyte, and the subsequent losses demonstrated a painful truth. Fuel dictated fate. Musashi, Yamato, and several cruisers sank not solely from firepower, but because their engines could not sustain maneuvering, leaving them vulnerable to relentless American air attacks. The Navy's greatest ships, designed for domination, had become immobile targets. Each barrel consumed in maneuvers or strikes was a barrel that could not be used again. The fleet was spending its lifeblood in a few desperate hours. Admiral Kurita's retreat through the San Bernardino Strait marked the symbolic end. Once a daring commander leading an elite strike force, he now commanded a retreat constrained entirely by fuel reserves. No bold flanking maneuvers, no torpedo ambushes, only a slow, calculated withdrawal. Behind him, the legacy of a once mighty navy crumbled under the simple arithmetic of supply. By December 26th, remaining fuel stocks were insufficient for even a coordinated defense. Ships sat in port, aircraft grounded, men idle, waiting for what would never come. The psychological impact was profound. Sailors accustomed to bold attacks and disciplined formations now walked the decks, knowing that their engines could not move, their planes could not fly, and their weapons could not reach the enemy. Morale plummeted faster than strategic capability. The men of the Imperial Navy saw their power vanish, not in battle, but in the empty barrels of fuel that silently dictated their fate. Reports from officers described despair more acute than fear. The realization that their losses were not inflicted by the enemy's courage, but by an unseen, inexorable arithmetic beyond human control. By early 1945, the situation was irreversible. Japan's last aircraft carriers were kept in harbor, reserved for a decisive battle that could no longer be mounted. Battleships remained moored, engines drained, ammunition stored but futile. Supply convoys became targets not just of American submarines, but of the Navy's own limitations. Each liter of fuel consumed in a mission could never be recovered. The war had become a logistical impossibility for Japan. The endgame was clear. The Imperial Navy had been defeated not solely by superior firepower, but by the inexorable mathematics of industrial logistics. American oil refineries produced 1.8 billion barrels annually. Japanese synthetic and domestic production barely approached 100 million. Every American ship could be refueled. Every plane could strike repeatedly. Every operation supported continuously. Japan could only ration, calculate, and hope. The hope failed. If you like this kind of stories, don't hesitate to subscribe.